Hey guys, in this video we're going to explore how you might implement user authentication in sessions in a ReactQL application. First of all, I'm going to show you a demo of an example app that I've built. I'm going to show you how you can get the code and run this locally yourself. And then finally we're going to take a deep dive under the hood to check out how this was orchestrated in userline code. So you've got some ideas and some concepts that you might carry forward into a production grade application. So first of all, just to show you a demo of this in practice. So we have a login box here. This takes an email and a password. I can go ahead and click login, and instantly you can see that we get an error message. Now the nice thing about this is GraphQL. We're actually communicating with the server to get this error back. This is not front-end validation, so this is really nice. It means that we can control things on the server side and get the messages fed through to the browser. You can see that I can click here to get some sample information that's been stored in the database that we can validate against. And finally below we've got logged in details. So again, this is GraphQL. This is pulling back a session request, and if we've got a valid session it will populate these fields. So let's first go ahead and just enter some random information into email and some information into password. We'll click login. We can see we get this validation prompt to say please enter a valid email. I'll go ahead and enter my email and I'll click login, and we get another message instantly: an account with that email does not exist. So this is actually checking against a backend database. In this case we're using an in-memory SQLite DB. But as you can see from the code, as we go into that in just a little bit, you can very easily swap that out for a MySQL database or PostgreSQL or any other backend. And because we're using SQLize as a library to abstract the database, we actually don't need any code changes other than the connection string to our database. So again, we'll go into that in just a few moments. So let's use this sample. We'll say john@example.com and grab this password. I'll click login. So the error box disappeared, and as you can see below, logged in details, we've got a user ID, we've got email, name, and a last name as well. Now the cool thing about this is the information has actually been stored in a JWT token. If we open our console, we check out local storage, we get item, and let's grab ReactQL JWT. You can see we've got a string here that we can use to validate against the server, which is how I got this information back. But we've also got that stored in a cookie. So if I go ahead and hit refresh, obviously when we go and execute the request against the server, the local storage at that point is not initialized, so we're relying on cookies to bring that information back. And you can see that that worked. And it's not just browser side either. If we go to developer view source, you can see that information has been embedded in. So we've got a first name there of John, last name of Doe, and all the other information that we need, along with the session that's actually stored against our state that's been rehydrated in the browser as well. So it's very nice. What this means is that we can use this in environments where we have cookies, so we can pass that along, as well as environments where we don't. We might be using a more stateless approach, such as mobile. So let's go ahead and first of all see where we can grab this code for ourselves. So we've got ReactQL/examples hosted on GitHub. This is a home of all example projects built for version 2.0 of the kit and above. At the moment we have one project which is users, sessions and auth. Instructions are included on this page to show you how to grab any particular project, install the npm packages and run them. There are two modes. We have development mode for all ReactQL projects as well as production. If we head over to my terminal, you can see that I'm running this in development mode, and we've got a whole bunch of information that's been logged out into the console. In this particular case, these are SQL statements that are being run against our database on the server. So this is a monolithic application. We're actually building this in one place, and if we click on this code, we can see this code that's executed in both the browser and on the server. So we're going to just design this once and define all of our logic once. It's going to run in both environments. So let's actually see how this works under the hood. So I'm going to go over to Atom, and as with all ReactQL projects, it all starts in source app.js. Now, new for version 2.0 of ReactQL, we can define pretty much everything we need in userland. So in other words, within the source folder, the src folder. And what that means is it's very easy then to upgrade the kit to the latest version without touching anything outside of the source folder. A lot of ReactQL typically lives under the kit folder, so it's going to update all of that stuff without touching our own code. So let's go through this. We'll take it chunk by chunk. We won't go through line by line, but I'll pick up some pieces that may not be obvious. So the first thing is that we're importing this config that's provided to us by the kit. And if we look at that config, you can essentially see that it's a bunch of functions that enable us to define various different configuration parameters for different parts of our app. So we can do things like enable a GraphQL server or set our Apollo instantiation logic. It means that we can keep everything within app. So we're going to grab that. We'll also grab this main component, and that basically just sets up the UI for us. So if we check out components and then main, you can see that we're pulling from the semantic UI package, and that's what gives us these nice little forms out the box. We're not spending any time on boilerplate. And if we head back over to the code, you can see it's very, very simple. We'll create a grid, we've got a header, login, and user. And we'll go through some of those components to see what's going on. Of course, we've also added some CSS there. We can check that out. It's very simple. It's just pulling in a class. But the nice thing with ReactQL is you can actually pull that in line and just define that on any particular element within React. We don't need to worry about the Webpack configuration. ReactQL takes care of that for us. Heading back to app, you can see that isomorphically we define that we're enabling a GraphQL server. And what this tells the server, first of all, is that we want that GraphQL to be set up server-side, but also it tells our browser bundle to point the endpoint as our server. So it takes care of all that stuff for us by simply defining enable GraphQL server. Now what we have in ReactQL are these server blocks, and basically whenever we see this if server, it's only going to run server side. All of our client side code is going to be filtered out by Webpack. It's using a concept called tree shaking, basically gets rid of anything within this. So what that means is that we can then require certain packages that are perhaps too heavy to load on the client side, or perhaps are only relevant on the server within this block, and we can do so safely. So you see the first thing that we do is we require this DB fixtures. Let's head over and see that. So again, this is userland, everything's within the source folder. And if we check out fixtures, you can see basically what we're doing is we're pulling in DB, and if we head over to index, you can see this is super easy to define. We simply import the SQLite library that we're using as our abstraction library in order to communicate with our database, and then we're defining a new connection to an in-memory SQLite. Again, if you want to swap this out for MySQL, PostgreSQL, something like that, you would literally just put a new connection string in, and that's all there is to it. Then down here, we're giving some information to sync the database with our fixtures. So basically what we're doing is we're pulling in this this common thing here. So if we just grab this, you can see we just got a couple of users there, and in plain text we define email, password, and the first name and last name. So we're using that in order to populate our database, which is why if we go over to the terminal, you can see initially when we run this on the server side, we've got some additions there, some insert statements and such to the database. That takes care of that for us. Heading back to app, you can then see that we define relationships between the tables. So we're saying that a user has many sessions, and sessions belongs to a user. This is just the SQLite way of wiring up two different models. And you can see we've got a user model and a session model. If we want, we can deep dive into this, just seeing how this is set up with an ID, an email, a password, and a first name. All of this is heavily documented, so you can just go through the source code at your leisure to see how it's all wired. I'll skip over that for now. Next, we're setting our GraphQL schema, and this basically defines the root entry point into our app. At any stage, if we want to, we can head over to /GraphQL, and we get this graphical browser, and we can actually look at our root types here. We've got our queries, we can pull back session and users. So for example, if I wanted to grab the session and I want to get the user, and within that I want to get an ID, and I want to see whether there are errors on this particular query, with field or message, I can hit play, and you can see I've got no errors, and we've got a ID there for the user. In fact, I can also put in a first name, or we can grab our first name. And the reason this works is because now we've actually authenticated the user in our previous step. If we head over and put this in a new window, we've got this valid user. But if I was to go over to cookies and delete this cookie, hit refresh, you can see that user's disappeared. And also if we go back to GraphQL, hit play, this time we get invalid session ID because we're not using the cookie. We could, if we wanted to, just send a stateless JWT, but that's a separate piece, and we'll go through that in just a second. So at this point, we're basically setting up our GraphQL schema, and again, this is only relevant on the server side. So we're pulling this in on the server, and basically if we head over to this GraphQL directory and go to index, you can see that that sets up all of the stuff that we can see in our graphical browser. So our query root object, as well as mutations such as create user and login. I won't go over create user in this video, but suffice to say it's just as easy to create a user as it is to log in, and in fact you can use the self-documented schema by simply going to graphical and heading over and seeing the parameters and such that it accepts, as well as the response types that it sends back. And now this is of course set up to also have field validation, which is what this user response is. We've got errors, we've got field with field and message, and that's how that populates any errors that are sent back there on the screen. So basically in this GraphQL index file, we're setting up the query, we're setting up our mutations, and we're exporting that. And then we're using this helper function that's built into ReactQL called setGraphQL Schema. We also set the cause config, and the reason we do that is because we want cross origins or cross-site origin requests to be handled properly. In this case, we're saying that we want credentials to be sent back and forth, so the set cookie header will work, and then that enables us to also go over to port 8080, which is our development port, and get the same thing working there as well as the origin. You might not need something like that if you're serving it your app from one place, from one site, from one domain, but this is what we can set up if we need to in userland. We've also got some middleware. So basically middleware is what's going to attach to our Koa server-side requests. And in this case, this is a good place for us to be able to pull out the authorization header. So if we send over a JWT request with the authorization and a bearer token, we can pull that out. Or alternatively, we can send a cookie. And as you can see, it's as simple as defining one line. If we've got an authorization header, we're removing the bearer token prefix that is typically added in the authorization header, and we're storing that against our context state object. Now this is something that's available on the server side throughout all requests, as well as when processing the GraphQL request. So as you can see in just a moment, that's actually fed through so that we can use this JWT in order to validate a session. We've got this else block. So above we had if server, so now we're saying if we're not on the server, if we're browser only, do a couple of things that are specific to the browser. So in this case, we're setting the Apollo network options to also include credentials. So now we've got it both on the server side and on the browser side in order to be able to pass cookies back and forth. And also we've got this Apollo middleware. So what this does is it sets up our request options prior to sending an Apollo or GraphQL request through Apollo. In this case, we're getting the local storage item ReactQL JWT that we saw earlier. We're adding that along to our headers object as an authorization. Then we're saying initiate the next middleware in the chain. So it's as simple as that. In order to pass our JWT throughout the chain, we don't need to make any modifications to the kit whatsoever. Now let's check out the GraphQL. If we head over to index, you can see we've got a couple of mutations here. We've got login and create user. If we check out login first of all, I'll just go over to our session. So we've got a session type that's sent back that we've already seen. We've got this login mutation. It takes an email and it takes a password, both of which are strings. Then it resolves against the arguments that are passed along with our context. So remember, we attach the JWT to the state object on context. that's actually passed through automatically to GraphQL. So we've got access to that now. We've got access to the full request as well as being able to manipulate the response headers, which is really, really nice. So the first thing we do is we try and log in based on these credentials. If we get a valid response back, then we stick within this try block. Otherwise, we get an error thrown and we're able to send out errors back to the user. And because we've got access to our context, at this point we can actually set that against the cookie, which is why the cookie ReactQL JWT was properly sent back over to the browser. In this case, I'm saying HTTP only is false. That means we can access it programmatically. We don't actually need that line. We're not actually accessing the cookie. Instead, we're storing our response back into local storage in another part of GraphQL. I'll show you in just a second. And I've set here a fixed expiration into the future, but of course, typically in production, what you would do is you would set an expiration, let's say 30 days from today, and then it automatically expires. And you could do the same thing as well in the database so that the two match up. And if you want to validate whether the session is active, you've then got the cookie, which automatically invalidates, as well as server side. So if one of the two fail or both of them fail, the user is simply not logged in. So that's how the information is all fed back. If we check out our user GraphQL, you can see a couple of pieces here as well. So we've got user response type. That's going to send back our user information, and that's how information is able to feed through down into here once we're logged in. So our session uses that as a subtype in order to pass back a user object. And the nice thing about this is it's very easy to model this against SQLize. So if you have a look at this, for example, so we've got our user type up here, and our user response returns that user type, which is just the object and the user key on that object. But if you actually look at the user type itself, it's extremely simple. On all of our fields, we're simply defining them as strings, and then we've got this object called user, and we're able to pass back the key on the instance that's pulled back from SQLize. So you'll see there's no magic here, it's simply passing back the information that we need. And you'll note, for example, that in this case, password is something that is secret and something that we don't want to send back, make exposed to our response. So we've simply omitted that field. If we check out the other object to that, the counterpart, if you like, of GraphQL, we can see in DB user, we're simply defining that user with ID, email, password, first name and last name. We've provided some parameters in order to for instantiation in SQLize, and then scrolling down we've actually got our functions for creating a user, and in session we've also got login. Let me just show you through the login function to see how easy it is to wire this up to GraphQL. So scrolling down here, we've got login. The first thing we do is we create this new form error object, and form error is something that actually feeds back down into this errors variable here, and we're given a field and a message. So it's a very, very convenient mechanism that we've created in userland in order to define a field so that we can feed this back if we wanted to. We could add, let's say, a red border to this particular field, as well as to be able to create a message down here. So by default we set that up as our error object. Hopefully we won't need to use that, but if we do, it's there. And then we've got some very simple validation that just runs through our email checks, our password checks, and it throws that if there is an error. So what we can do back in sessions with our login mutation is we can simply catch that error, and we can send that back as errors, and GraphQL knows exactly what to do based on our user and error types and such that we've already defined further up in this this file. So we simply pass that back as a plain object response, and GraphQL does all of the translation for us under the hood to be able to send that back in a GraphQL compliant way. So that's essentially how all of the GraphQL and database pieces work. If we check out a couple of the components, we can see how we're feeding information back and forth. So let's check out the login component. So what we do here, again, we've got some styling from semantic, things like buttons, grids, forms, etc. That's pretty much self-explanatory, so we won't go into that for now. We're also pulling in this GraphQL helper from the React Apollo package. And this is a higher order component that allows us to inject GraphQL into the component itself. We're going to use this for both the login, which is this piece up here, as well as the logged in details, which is actually going to display the information. So let's go back and see what's happening. So first of all, I'm just setting up this thing called emails and passwords that just allows us to display this box here so that we've got some sample emails and passwords. And just like our fixtures file, this actually uses the common file here, which has our users, so that we've got information that works in both places. Scrolling down, you can see that we're adding this GraphQL higher order component. I'm using it as a decorator on the class, so that's basically going to bundle this as the sort of a component that's loaded on top of, if you like, this higher order component. I'm specifying the login mutation, which you can see under GQL mutations login. And that's basically just the GraphQL that needs to be sent back to the server with our email defined as a string and a password defined as a string. So we're able to pull that stuff in ReactQL as well, just by importing it in line. So that's really nice. So I'll head back to the login. And finally, we've got this magic formula here, this function called update, that basically allows us to define how we're updating the store state. Remember, Apollo uses Redux for store state. We're able to manipulate that directly, and that will automatically feed through to any other components that are listening to that particular piece of state, which we'll see in a moment our user is doing exactly. And you'll see this is just a few lines of code. We're creating a read query against the session. The session, by the way, is just this thing here where we're pulling a session, we're pulling our user information. So that's really, really simple. And we're simply updating that with the result of what comes back from a login mutation and writing that back to the query. And it's this that's the magic formula that's going to update state and then tell any components that's listening to that piece of Apollo state to automatically update. Let's check out the login component itself and see how it's doing the mutation. So we're setting up some blank variables for email and password, and we're assuming we've got no errors back. We've got a few handlers here to handle change state and such. This is just typical React stuff, so it's not that important in this context. Then we've got this try login function. This is doing all of the stuff that's necessary to communicate with GraphQL. So by using this GraphQL higher order component, what we get access to is this.props.mutate, which is the function where we can pass information back to our GraphQL server, does all of the communications using fetch and Apollo in the on the back end, so it's taking care of everything for us there. And what we get back once we await that promise is essentially the response data. So I'm pulling in the login key on the data object that's returned. If we have any errors, I'm setting the state to display the errors, which is why we're able to click login and see those errors immediately presented on the screen. Otherwise, I'm setting the state to no errors. And finally, we've got this server block. So remember, we're already sending back the ReactQL JWT as a cookie in another part of the application. But what I'm saying here is, if we're not running on the server, in other words, if we're running in the browser, also, because this was browser initiated, let's use this as a good time to set that JWT on the local storage as well. So if we do have a stateless environment that doesn't use cookies, we can store that information locally and we're good to go. Otherwise, we can catch any errors and we can do whatever we want there. In this case, I'm just logging that out to the console. So the actual render function is super simple. All we do is we'll pull the information from state. We're using local state in this case. ReactQL does bundle Redux as well, so if we need to set state globally through a Redux action and reducer, we can do that so other components can listen to it. But this is good enough for this little component. And then you can see that we feed through and display any messages. So that's super, super simple. We also have user, which again is listening to our GraphQL state. We set up some stuff here where we have some defaults. So before we were using a class, this time we're using a stateless function, or a pure function as it's known. in React, we're passing in the props as a parameter rather than using the class syntax. But it's just as simple. We're setting up some sample data there, assuming that we're using we have an empty user. Otherwise, we're setting up our fields to use the actual information that's injected by GraphQL. Further down, we'd pass in that information. As you can see, basically we just wrap this in GraphQL. In the previous example with login, we used a decorator. We can also use the vanilla syntax where we pass in the session query, which again is this thing. We've seen this before. And then we wrap that with the component. So you can see both the login and user also use this session, and it's because of login's update function up here that's available to us through the React Apollo GraphQL higher order component. We simply define that on options, that we're manipulating the state directly. And the reason we need to do this, typically Apollo would update state for us automatically by defining a data object from ID. So basically if we have an ID back from any of these records, let's say a user ID. So if we go ahead and use this example here, and I'll just pass this in, click login, we get this user ID back. And this, by the way, is why we're using this format of ID, a universally unique ID, so that we can have an ID that works across the entire application regardless of the table that it's on. Because we're using this, if we were to run any other GraphQL mutations that were to change any of this information, then the cache would automatically get invalidated and would update automatically and re-render these React components. But because initially we don't have any ID in order to update, because we've got a blank session, because as we've seen here, it's an invalid session ID, user is null. Because of that, we need to tell Apollo how we want to update state. So we do that manually by just injecting that onto our session. So that's essentially how it works. There are a few complicated pieces because there's a lot going on under the hood. You've got the SQLite instantiation through SQLize. You've got GraphQL that's operating on the server side, as well as being able to communicate with it from the front end. You've got pieces that are specific to UI. You've got all of these different floating pieces, as well as middleware that's handling the JWT. But when you actually break it down and check out what's going on in app.js, there's very, very little other than the boilerplate to set up GraphQL, to pass in a schema, to load the DB, and to set our cause and our handler object or function here for the middleware. There's very little besides. Everything else really is just components or something that's specific to a database model or a user-defined GraphQL type. So what we can do as a next stage, and I'll probably do this at some stage with the examples auth project that I've just shown you here, is we can augment this with the likes of social logins. We can have endpoints that can communicate with OAuth for things like Facebook or Google logins that can then feed into our user system and create a user based on the information that's passed back, and then feed through into our JWTs in order to commonly validate that user information. So I'll go into that in a future video. For now, this is just a little taster into what's possible without touching anything in the ReactQL kit. So enjoy. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Any questions, just let me know. Head over to the ReactQL areas on GitHub. You can see we've got the examples repo, we've got the CLI that does all the heavy lifting for creating a new project. We've got the kit itself that goes into the features of ReactQL. So we've got much, much more going on under the hood besides that I've not shown you in this video. Lots of stuff with techniques for server-side rendering, Webpack configurations and such. Any questions, just use the pertinent issue tracker and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Cheers.